Italian Pie is proud to support WYES and this episode of Wall Street Wrap-Up, and to promote the importance of financial literacy and education.
This week on Wall Street Wrap-Up, did you use Facebook between 2007 and last year? If so, you might be part of a $725 million class action settlement. We'll tell you why it pays to watch this show. Fox News settled their lawsuit, but it's going to cost them. The payout to Dominion will be just under $790 million. Ouch. And what luck, because scheduled for tonight, we'll be talking with author Steve Krakauer about his book, Uncovered, How the Media Got Cozy with Power and Abandoned Its Principles and Lost the People. Like Vince Lombardi used to say, between luck and skill, I'll take luck any day. I'm Andre Laborde. We've got these stories and more. It's Friday, and it's time for Wall Street Wrap-Up. Hi, I'm Andre Laborde. Welcome to Wall Street Wrap-Up. It's Friday, April the 21st, 2023. Were you a member of Facebook between 2007 to last year? If so, I'll tell you later in the show how you could be a part of a $725 million class action settlement. But first, how did our money do this week? Well, it was a negative week for stocks. Top sectors were discretionary staples and healthcare. Louisiana's Pool Corps was a top stock in the discretionary sector, as well as Norwegian Cruise Lines. And the sector laggards today were materials, energy, and technology. All the sectors ended negative for the week. And this week, the Dow Jones closed today at 33,809, down 0.2 of a point for the week. And for the S&P 500, they closed today at 4,133, down 0.1 of a point for the week. And the NASDAQ, they closed today at 12,072, which was down 0.4 of a point for the week. Samsung this week threatened to remove Google as their default search engine and use Microsoft's Bing. Now, they didn't do it, but just the threat of going to Bing will have those Googles aghast. Now, just so you know, when you open up your browser and Google pops up, Google pays for that. They pay Samsung $3 billion a year. Apple, they paid $20 billion a year. In fact, Apple's contract with Google will be expiring later this year. So you know there'll be new terms, all in Apple's favor. And here's a little bit of trivia. Google makes more money off of Microsoft's Windows than Microsoft does. Well, let's get to our guest tonight. Steve Krakauer is the author of Uncovered, How the Media Got Cozy with Power and Lost the People. Hi, Steve. Welcome to Wall Street Wrap-Up.
Hey, great to be on with you. Thank you.
Just a couple of years ago, just over half the people were trustful of the media. Now the number, as of about 2021, is about 36%. And I would possibly assume maybe last year, 2022, or this year in 2023, it might even be less. Is there a pivotal moment that people started to be untrustful of the press?
I really do try to track this because as you mentioned, this has gone off a cliff. And I think it's even more important to break down where that trust is. You know, people who identify as Democrats or liberal have fallen a little bit in the last 10 years, especially in the last 5 years, a little bit. People that are on the right have always been fairly distrustful of the corporate mainstream media, and that has gotten significantly worse. But the independent line, independents, people who I consider people who are apolitical, who are not on one side or the other, really kind of moderate independents, they went from essentially trusting the media to completely falling off a cliff and actually more like the right of this country, completely distrustful. I think it's somewhere in the 8 to 18% range that trust the media if you're an independent. That's unbelievable. And I think there's a couple key points here. Certainly the rise of social media has done a huge impact on losing this trust. But I think there's been some stories, 2014, 2015, the Trump era, COVID and beyond, that I think COVID in particular really solidified in a lot of people's minds this distrust for a lot of reasons.
You've got 30 Rockefeller Center, which has NBC, which also owns MSNBC and CNBC and so on, but they're owned by Comcast. You've got CNN, that was originally in Atlanta, but now they're in New York. You have CBS that is owned by Viacom, but they're just a couple of blocks away. And you've got Fox News, which is an avenue of the Americas. So is the geography that they're all so closely assimilated together, does that have a reason?
I do. I think that's a big factor in it. In fact, in Uncovered, I lay out five main problems with how we got to where we are in the media. And geographic bias, I think, is number one. There's ideological bias. I think we hear a lot about that. The bias of the media. A lot of people lean towards that, but that's been around for decades. Geographic bias is something a little bit more pervasive. And yes, the headquarters of a lot of these media outlets have been in New York and to a secondary degree in DC for a little while. CNN, in fact, when I worked at CNN in 2013, they essentially moved from Atlanta as the headquarters to New York and DC secondarily. So it's a fairly recent phenomenon, but also it's not just that these places are so isolated in those areas. It's also that those areas have become more and more of a bubble in comparison to the rest of this country, and because of that, we get these sort of problems, these mistakes that just snowball into larger and larger issues for the audience and losing trust of the media.
You had Ben Rhodes, who, let's say, was working with the Obama campaign. Well, his brother, I think, was the head or the president of ABC. You had Jay Carney, who was a presidential spokesman. He was married to, or he is married, rather, I should say, to Claire Shipman, who is a reporter.
Right.
And you go to, as they say, the Georgetown cocktail parties. I mean, is it too cozy?
Oh yeah. Coziness with power. As I lay out in the book, that is one of the big things where, as you track, there's the Obama administration was very interconnected with a lot of these mainstream media outlets through marriage, through brothers and sisters, and so you can go right on it down the line there. But that's almost even the sort of coziness that I'm less worried about. That's something that we all know. It's maybe you don't know because you haven't looked around at it, but it's all available publicly. What's not available is the coziness that we don't know about. It's the friendships, it's the covering for others, and I lay out in this chapter tell a little bit of the Harvey Weinstein story. I talked to people who were at NBC. Rich McHugh was one of the reporters who worked with Ronan Farrow in trying to uncover the Harvey Weinstein story and was essentially killed at NBC because of the relationships that Harvey had with some of the executives at NBC, what he knew about NBC, about Matt Lauer, start to go down this road about Jeffrey Epstein, about the way Epstein was connected with people at other media outlets, and who, again, I mean, you start to open these doors and start to really understand that it's not necessarily by design. These aren't all best friends, they're not all family members, but there is in many instances an unspoken coziness, a wink wink, a nod that the people that are protected are the ones that are in these same elite circles. And the media, which never used to be this way, decades ago it was not like this. Now they are, and that leads to so many more problems than even the audience truly understands.
You have ABC is owned by Disney, NBC, which has, again, as I said, MSNBC and CNBC
Right.
and NBC. They're owned by Comcast. You've got corporate structure ownerships. CNN, who you used to work for, they're now owned by Warner Discovery, I think.
Yeah.
So you've got this corporate hierarchy. Are they getting, when you work in the newsroom, are you getting maybe marching orders or guidelines that you're not supposed to say or not supposed to do from the C-suite, from above?
Yeah, I think that it's a little bit more subtle than that. I would say that yes, as you mentioned, these were large media companies to begin with, but now these are larger media companies owned by even larger corporate media behemoths that have all of these other interconnected parts. CNN is associated with TNT and TBS and HBO and now Discovery, and it's like you start going down the line, and there's all of these conflicts of interest, and they don't necessarily impede in the day to day of how a news organization might cover a story. But they are absolutely there. And it's something where a journalist may not necessarily hear that, oh, you have to cover this or you can't cover it this way. But that there are parameters to how far outside of the purview you can go because it's only natural. I mean, you start to write a story, every other line is going to be, oh, the full disclosure, this person knows this person, or this person's an investor, or this, it gets very, very complicated very fast. And it's part of the problem with even places like an ESPN, it's a sports network. It's just a network that should never be fallen victim to some of these real problems that we see in the media, and yet they are, because they also are part of this whole corporate coziness. And they also are in this business model right now, this financial incentive structure that's under attack because viewers and readers are changing their viewing habits, and mistakes get made in this void that's created by the sort of unsteadiness of the business.
During COVID. All right, well, one of the major sponsors on news shows was Pfizer. Well, Pfizer makes the vaccine. So if a reporter is about to do a story that has something to do with somebody who brings them a lot of bread and butter, a lot of sponsorship, are they going to feel any heat to try to not feel the full force of maybe having the higher ups contact them?
Of course, right? It's only natural. Yeah, the
Follow the money.
interlocking is exactly, exactly. And I think it's something that, Rick Sanchez, who was at CNN before I was there, but a real notable figure, really interesting guy. And he was describing this, where you look at the corporate boards of something like a Disney, and then follow where those people who serve on the boards of Disney, which again owns ABC News, where else do they serve? And you can look at, they've got technology companies, they've got financial services companies. You just go right down the line. And it doesn't necessarily mean that these board members are telling the average reporter at ABC what they can and can't cover. But if you know where those associations are, and as you mentioned, the sponsorships, the advertising is front and center. I mean, that is very much a part of what you're seeing on a day-to-day basis. It's only natural that this sort of hesitancy can come. And again, the job of a journalist should be to pursue the story with a real vigor, be real curious about everything, and never give in to the corporate power or to the coziness or to the elite power structure. And yet that's the business these days, even more so than it ever was before.
When you were at CNN, if I'm not mistaken, you worked for a brief period at a time when Jeff Zucker, who was president or the head of CNN, was there. And I remember you were mentioning in the book how he had a focus on winning. He wanted to win. But, to some people, winning or like success has different meanings. Was winning meaning ratings? Was winning meaning bringing in more money for the network? Was it being first to getting the story correct? What was that?
I think it was all of the above. I do, as you mentioned in chapter 6, write about my personal experience working very closely with Jeff. I was at the time overseeing how television lives on digital properties. So how does it live on CNN.com or through our social media sites? And that was something that Jeff was very interested in, because it was how people find CNN in all the different platforms. And so we worked very closely together. And I had a great experience working with him. One of the great appeals of Jeff was he was like this manager that was able to kind of go around the newsroom and galvanize the team. And yet winning was the focus. And there's lots of different variations of what winning was, but it certainly was in driving the story, in many instances getting the story right. And it was also around making sure that the audience understood what was the most important thing. But then you start entering into the political space, and Jeff has a great relationship going back decades with Donald Trump, a friendship. He was at his wedding, but then becomes this fight, this antagonistic relationship. And inside of that, now all of a sudden, we've got to cover one great story, and that's our fight with Donald Trump, winning because the ratings were great, but also winning because now you have this one storyline that everyone at the network feels like they're a part of. That can lead to mistakes. Jeff was a brilliant, genius at the news, but he was a real micromanager, let's say. He was involved in everything from the chyrons you saw on the bottom of the screen to the guests that were being involved. He was very, very hands-on. And that was exciting in a lot of ways because the boss is there, he's in the control room with you. But if there was a big, massive effort, like there was during those Trump years, Jeff was at the helm of that. And I think that, in many ways it gave CNN an identity. It was their identity during those years. But in other ways, they tried to have it both ways, like the New York Times, like the Washington Post. How do you insert some level of subjectivity and opinion while also maintaining this veil of objectivity, which I think became obvious to the audience was not really there?
Yeah, I don't know if you were there at that time when Chris Cuomo was doing the evening primetime. He would have his brother Andrew on quite a bit, and then later that Jeff Zucker fired Chris Cuomo. Well, there was a lot of things that Chris Cuomo knew about Jeff Zucker that he later, through lawsuits, exposed, such as Jeff Zucker was having a relationship with, I think, CNN's head of marketing, Allison Gollust, I think.
Gollust, yeah.
Gollust. But also, which was, to me, just as important, if not more so, was that Allison Gollust and maybe Jeff Zucker were steering Chris Cuomo to have more interactions with his brother, Andrew. So, he first fired him for doing it, but then it turned out that he was also behind the scenes pushing it, or Allison was. Was that true?
Yeah, it became absolutely. So this is another story that was happening in the wake of COVID. Really, it was actually, I think, very much tied to this uneasiness of the COVID period. Chris got COVID, one of the first people, really the first prominent figures to come down with COVID, and he started broadcasting his show from the basement of his house. And it was compelling television. And then he had on his brother, Andrew Cuomo, who at the time was seen as really the face of doing COVID right in New York. And of course, it was naturally a really scary time also because of New York, New Jersey, and how prevalent it was then. But it wasn't what Chris really ultimately got fired for was the way it became clear that he was involved in helping craft the message for what came later with Governor Andrew Cuomo, which is the sexual harassment and misconduct claims, and that Chris was behind the scenes sort of serving as advisor to his brother. That's a huge no-no. But before that, as we now found thanks to Chris and what he put out about his bosses, yeah, Jeff Zucker, Allison Gollust, and others were involved in figuring out what time should Andrew Cuomo be doing his press conference, that we can coordinate on when we should air it on CNN. I mean, this is a huge mess, and that it just goes to show that when the guardrails are off, these bad decisions start getting made, and they just start getting exacerbated.
Do you feel that Jeff Zucker was the reason for the guardrails being off?
It's hard to say because, look, it goes beyond CNN. This was happening in newsrooms across the country, and I shouldn't say across the country, across the dial, let's say. I mean, it was all New York and D.C. for the most part, based journalism. I look at like the Washington Post and their decision to say democracy dies in darkness. This was started during the Trump years, the decision to begin this count of thousands of mistruths that Donald Trump said. And then, of course, once Donald Trump leaves office, they shut that project down and no longer are tracking how many mistruths are coming out of Joe Biden's mouth. No, I think it was more pervasive than that. I think it became a mission that was for networks, for newspapers, that this was so important, this existential threat that they're fighting with to save democracy, which I think was ridiculous, but that's what they believed. I think that they started to go into people's brains in these newsrooms.
They have so many different types of media. Now, at one time, you had three networks: ABC, NBC, CBS. So it was divided in those three of the televised media. Today, you've got so much more, and now you're throwing in social media with that. You're throwing in Twitter. So the audience is dropping on all of these types of platforms, which would I assume correctly to say that also means that the ad dollars are also decreasing as well?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, this is one of the big problems, I think, that leads to more problems is the way that the financial structure of the media has changed. It no longer, when you had three networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, you were trying to reach the broadest number of people possible because to be successful, you needed to have broad swaths of America come in. Yes, you still would like a giant audience, but you've got to be realistic. At this point, your audience is declining. Viewing habits are changing. They've got so much more choice now thanks to independent media. And so you end up grabbing on to the lowest hanging fruit and making sure that at least don't alienate those people, right? Well, that also leads to journalistic decisions that get made to keep your audience, the ones that will love you, keep them safe, keep them happy. And then, if you lose some of the people on the margins, well, that's not so bad.
Just this week, Steve, Fox News settled for, I want to say it was $787 million. And
Right.
I think they felt like they got away pretty good because they didn't have to go, no one had to go on the stand. And so they walked away with that. And just what you were saying, where the whole purpose for this was against Dominion from the 2020 presidential election. So it looked like from what was being leaked was that they were concerned on losing that core audience, their base of audience, because Fox, their audience was upset that Fox called Arizona so fast for Joe Biden. Do you think that by their settling for $787 million, do you think Fox will lose any of that audience?
I don't think they will. I think that it was a decision that was made to, I think, as you correctly diagnosed, let's not get all of our top talent and Rupert Murdoch to go on the stand and to continue the kind of embarrassing PR elements that might come out over these next 6 weeks. It was settled to be a 6 week trial that was about to go, and everyone in the media was down in Delaware very excited about this because they, of course, they hate Fox News and want to play this all out. So I don't think I think that certainly they lose monetarily. They would have lost big on the PR side, but I don't think the audience ultimately was going to be affected. I think that in those very uneasy, approximately 11 to 14 days after the election, there was a real sense of, are we going to lose our audience? And they had to really be smart. And as you saw through those text messages that came out, there was a lot of internal trying to figure out, what should we do about this? We cannot lose our audience. And they were able to stem the tide and be able to keep the audience ultimately, and they got their audience back, no problem. But because of those very uneasy 10 to 14 days, it cost them $787 million.
Most companies that size have insurance. Would the insurance cover something like that? Or is that something has to come out of Rupert Murdoch's pocket?
I don't know. I think that it's going to ultimately have to come out of Rupert's pocket at some point. And it's lucky for him. $787 million is nothing like what it might be for you or I. Yeah, they'll be all right in the end. Fox makes a massive amount of money compared to even some of their other competitors in the media.
Steve, what about artificial intelligence? We're hearing so much more about that. Right now, you are Steve Krakauer, I am Andre Laborde, and we are talking, and you actually said what you said, and same thing for me. But there may be a day coming up, and possibly in the near future, with what people hear you didn't actually say or I didn't say. How worried should people be with AI, especially those in the news media? And something else, too, I'm thinking of? Let's say anchors, pick your favorite anchor. Why should a corporation spend $2 million, $3 million to hire an anchor for the evening news when they can have somebody that looks identically like a person giving the news?
AI is going to become a major story in really every industry, frankly, and certainly most of them, and the media is no exception. I see this playing out and how do the average journalist these days at a digital media outlet just churns out a story as essentially an aggregation of someone else's reporting. You don't need a person to do that anymore. You could just use artificial intelligence to spit that out. So I think this is going to make it so the negative thing is that a lot of journalists who are not necessarily at the top of their game are going to be replaced by AI.
Steve, we haven't even gotten to Twitter and the other social media yet. I hope you come back.
Hey, it was great talking with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Hey, if you've got a question or a comment about the show, we would love to hear from you. Make it concise, make it pithy, and write us. And notice the new email address at andre@benacapital.com. Well, let's look at the markets heading into next week. But first, on this day in 1939, what was introduced at the New York World's Fair that we still sit through today? We'll have the answer in just a moment. Well, on this day in 1939, what was introduced at the New York's World's Fair that we still sit through today? The first commercial television broadcast. And it was conducted by RCA's David Sarnoff. Well, let's have a wrap-up on Wall Street. If you're a Facebook user between May of 2007 to December of last year, you have until August the 25th to claim a portion of a $725 million class action settlement. Now, the lawsuit was due to Facebook's disclosing that the information of 87 million users was improperly shared with Cambridge Analytica. So if you've had an active Facebook account between May of 2007 to December of 2022, you have until August the 25th to make your claim. If you had more than one Facebook account, then you have to file on each individual. Now, Mickey Mouse, he's biting back. And Bob Iger and Disney are telling lobbyists to set up the fight against the state of Florida and against Governor Ron DeSantis. Disney had secured leasing from an appointed board that DeSantis disbanded, and Disney is saying that they could be going to court to have a fight of it. Now, if you remember, this whole thing started when Disney's former CEO, Bob Chapek, criticized the Florida law of not teaching sex education of kindergarten through the 3rd grade. Well, this doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon. And according to CNBC, the Oakland A's are set to be moving their national baseball team out of Oakland to Las Vegas, where what goes on in Vegas stays in Vegas. Now, if you remember, Oakland already lost their NFL Raiders team to Vegas just a few years ago. And according to the Centers for Disease Control, 1/5 or 20% of U.S. children were obese before the pandemic. Well, during the lockdown, weight gain surged among children. Last year, over 500 children had bariatric stomach surgery, and that is confronting rising obesity rates in children. Well, that's a wrap-up on Wall Street Wrap-Up. And finally, it was 117 years ago this week. On April the 18th, 1906, the great San Francisco earthquake occurred, wrecking over $40 billion in today's money and damages to the city and causing over 3,000 deaths. Now, one man, Amedeo Giannini, who ran the Bank of Italy, he hitched up his wagon, his horse and wagon, and drove through the devastated streets of San Francisco to get to his bank. He opened his vault and unloaded the securities into the wagon. And after the earthquake, San Francisco needed rebuilding. But the other banks either couldn't or wouldn't make loans because they too suffered from the quake. But Amedeo Giannini immediately opened up on the docks of San Francisco where the others could not. Now, the former Bank of Italy, through years, has made many acquisitions, and they also changed their name. From the streets of San Francisco, where Giannini drove his wagon 117 years ago this week to unload his vault into his wagon, the Bank of Italy is now called Bank of America. You know, just as in 1906, it's true today. The early bird gets the worm. Well, do you have insurance with John Hancock? When you pay your premiums, either monthly or even annually, the money you send to the insurance company is known in the industry as the float. Insurance companies invest these premiums in the hopes that when and if they do have to pay out a claim, the money they made is more than what they have to pay out. Now, don't you wish you knew how these insurance companies invest so you too can invest your money? Well, next week, we're going to be talking with Matt Miskin. Matt is the co-chief investment strategist at John Hancock, with assets under management of over $226 billion. Next week, Matt Miskin, co-chief investment strategist, John Hancock. Well, that's our show for this Friday, April 21st. My thanks to Steve Krakauer for joining us tonight, but especially we appreciate you for allowing us into your homes this evening. Have a fun weekend with the ones you love and a productive week ahead. I'll see you next week. And remember, if it's Friday, it's Wall Street Wrap-Up. I'm Andre Laborde. Remember, money never sleeps. Good night.
Italian Pie is proud to support WYES and this episode of Wall Street Wrap-Up, and to promote the importance of financial literacy and education.